共通テストに出た読解のスピードと精度が上がる副詞468。共通テストでは副詞は見落とされがちですが、実は英文の論理と筆者の意図を理解するために非常に重要です。
Absolutely. Accidentally. Accordingly. Accurately. Actively. Actually. Additionally. Adequately. Admittedly. Affectionately. Afterward. Almost. Altogether. Amazingly. Angrily. Annually. Anxiously. Apparently. Approximately. Arbitrarily. Arguably. Around. Artificially. Aside. Astonishingly. Automatically. Badly. Barely. Beautifully. Beforehand. Believably. Bitterly. Blindly. Boldly. Briefly. Brilliantly. Broadly. Busily. Calmly. Carefully. Carelessly. Certainly. Cheaply. Cheerfully. Clearly. Closely. Coincidentally. Comfortably. Commonly. Comparatively. Completely. Concurrently. Confidently. Consciously. Consequently. Considerably. Consistently. Constantly. Continually. Continuously. Conveniently. Correctly. Courageously. Critically. Crucially. Curiously. Currently. Daily. Dangerously. Daringly. Decisively. Deeply. Deliberately. Delicately. Delightfully. Densely. Desperately. Differently. Diligently. Directly. Distinctly. Doubtfully. Dramatically. Dreadfully. Eagerly. Easily. Effectively. Efficiently. Effortlessly. Elaborately. Elegantly. Elsewhere. Emotionally. Emphatically. Entirely. Equally. Especially. Essentially. Eventually. Evidently. Exactly. Exclusively. Explicitly. Extensively. Extraordinarily. Extremely. Fairly. Faithfully. Familiarly. Far. Fashionably. Fast. Fatally. Favorably. Fearfully. Fiercely. Finally. Firmly. Fluently. Fondly. Foolishly. Formally. Fortunately. Frankly. Freely. Frequently. Frightfully. Fully. Fundamentally. Generally. Gently. Genuinely. Gladly. Gracefully. Gradually. Gratefully. Greatly. Happily. Hard. Hardly. Hastily. Healthily. Heavily. Helpfully. Highly. Honestly. Hopefully. Hopelessly. Horizontally. Horribly. Hourly. However. Humorously. Hurriedly. Ideally. Identically. Immediately. Immensely. Impatiently. Implicitly. Importantly. Impressively. Inappropriately. Incredibly. independently, indifferently, individually, inevitably, informally, initially, innocently, inquisitively, instantly, intellectually, intelligently, intensely, intentionally, interestingly, internally, internationally, intimately, invariably, invisibly, involuntarily, ironically, irregularly, irresponsibly, joyfully, keenly, kindly, lately, legally, lightly, likely, literally, logically, loosely, loudly, luckily, madly, mainly, manually, markedly, meaningfully, mechanically, merely, merrily, mildly, miraculously, miserably, moderately, momentarily, mostly, mysteriously, naturally, nearly, neatly, negatively, nervously, nicely, normally, notably, nowadays, obviously, occasionally, officially, openly, optimistically, orally, originally, outwardly, painfully, partially, particularly, patiently, perfectly, periodically, permanently, personally, physically, plainly, pleasantly, politely, poorly, positively, potentially, powerfully, practically, precisely, preferably, presently, primarily, promptly, properly, publicly, purely, quickly, quietly, randomly, rapidly, rarely, readily, really, reasonably, recently, regularly, relatively, reliably, reluctantly, remarkably, repeatedly, respectfully, responsibly, restlessly, roughly, routinely, sadly, safely, satisfactorily, scarcely, securely, seemingly, seldom, selectively, sensibly, separately, seriously, sharply, shortly, shyly, silently, similarly, simply, sincerely, slightly, slowly, smoothly, solemnly, solidly, sometimes, somewhat, soon, specifically, speedily, steadily, strategically, strictly, strongly, stubbornly, subsequently, successfully, suddenly, sufficiently, suitably, superficially, surprisingly, suspiciously, swiftly, symbolically, systematically, technically, temporarily, tenderly, terribly, thankfully, thoroughly, thoughtfully, thus, tightly, timely, tirelessly, totally, traditionally, tragically, truly, typically, ultimately, uncomfortably, unfortunately, universally, unnecessarily, unusually, urgently, usefully, uselessly, usually, vaguely, vainly, vastly, verbally, vigorously, violently, virtually, visibly, voluntarily, warmly, weakly, wearily, weirdly, well, widely, wildly, wisely, wonderfully, wrongly, yearly, yesterday,